returned to Japan a little after the war ended in 1946. And he went on to make his most highly regarded films in the late 1940s and 1950s, perhaps most well-known of which is Tokyo Story of 1953. Now, the gem that we will be watching early summer is, as I said, from 1951, which he co-wrote with a frequent collaborator named Noda Kogo. And Early Summer was one of about 1,000 feature films that were made by Japanese production companies between 1945 and 1952. That is during this period when Japan was occupied by the U.S. after the war. Now, when considering the question of what Ozu was trying to say in this film, I think we should also keep in mind that this was not a time of unrestricted expression in films, precisely because we're talking about films that were created during the period of American occupation. So there was a censorship regime there. So, especially up until the late 1940s, the U.S. occupation authorities were quite stringent about what was going to appear, what was appropriate to appear in films. So up until 1949, 2 copies of every screenplay had to be submitted in English in advance to the occupation's advisors. And on many occasions, there was a lot of back and forth about what could and could not be in the films before it was approved. So anything that seemed vaguely like communist propaganda, right? So scenes of labor strikes or demonstrations, for example, anything that seemed like criticism of the U.S., or at least what the censors would pick up on as criticism of the U.S., was off limits. So directors were supposed to avoid any images of GIs or jeeps, English language signs, buildings that were controlled by occupation forces, burned out areas. These were all things that were considered off limits. So as a result, in most occupation era films, there doesn't seem to be, at least explicitly, there doesn't seem to be an occupation, and there don't seem to be any Americans. And I think this, at least in literal concrete ways that the censors would have picked up on. And I think this is also the case with Early Summer as well. So this question of what Ozu was trying to say, I think we have to consider how much of the film was shaped by the kind of conditions under which he was working, as much as by what Ozu himself was trying to say. So Early Summer was not just released in October of 1951, it was also set in this time period of the early 1950s. So we could pause here to ask another set of questions, which is how much of what Ozu was trying to say in the film was about the time in which it was made, and to what extent do the themes of the film transcend this particular moment in time? Why did he decide to set the film in his present? And how might the time in which he was writing and making the film have shaped what he was expressing in the film? And I think one thing that we might consider as a theme of the film is the idea of a kind of Japan in transition at this particular moment in time in the early 1950s. A Japan that's kind of betwixt and between the war and the post-war. This is a moment in Japanese history where the present might have seemed kind of suspended or caught between the past and the future. So the war was over, had been over for some years, but the personal sacrifices that were made and the losses that were suffered in the war were still acutely felt. Right? The war was over, but Japan was still occupied by American forces. The treaty, the San Francisco Peace Treaty that would mark the end of the American occupation of Japan, was signed in September of 1951, which was just 1 month before the film was released. Didn't come into force, that is, the occupation doesn't end until April of 1952, the following year. So the gaze is kind of towards the future, but it was also not at all clear what that future would bring. So in the film, the emotional weight of the war, I think, is still central. It's not central, but it is very much present, which is to say that we learn, for example, that Noriko's brother, Shoji, is missing in action from the war, and he's presumed dead. And there seems to be acknowledgement of his death, but without any kind of certain closure. So without the certainty of a future that is closed off, Shoji's death is not and cannot be spoken of very much. So Noriko's mother, who has presumably lost her son, meets periodically with another woman in her neighborhood who's also suffered personal losses during the war, and they just sit, saying nothing. And there's a sense that time is moving inexorably forward, and the wartime past, though starting to fade into the distance, is still very much present. And perhaps this encapsulates the idea of the post-war, right? Literally, the war has ended, but the period is still defined as the one that followed the war, the post-war. That is, the war is still the point of reference. And I would add that this is particularly true in 1951, but the idea of Japan being in a post-war state is one that lingers for decades and decades and decades. So, there's this kind of whole idea of Japan's long post-war. Officially, the government comes out in the 1950s and says, okay, the post-war is now over, we're moving on. But then the government finds that it has to make this declaration fairly repeatedly over the course of the post-war period. So you get it every several decades, the government comes out and says the post-war is really over now, it's really over. And the fact that they had to keep saying this is a sign that, right, the sense of the post-war was not in fact over. And there was a moment, in the late 80s, in 1989, when Emperor Hirohito dies, where some people consider that as a kind of ending of the post-war. But still, without anything that marks the beginning of another phase, the post-war kind of continues, such that even prime ministers in the early 2000s were saying, all right, now the post-war is really over because we're in this new millennium. So the point is, and so there's some now who, just to go off on a little bit of a tangent, there's some people now who think that maybe the disaster in Fukushima might actually be the marker of the post-war, and that is actually a start of some other era. But the point is that this has been a very long post-war for Japan. So the war continues as a reference point, as something that defined that which followed. That idea very much endures, even though it was particularly acute in 1951. So, one reason why this being in the post-war feels particularly acute in 1951 is obviously because the occupation is not yet over, as I was saying. And the American occupation operated on the assumption that Japan's wartime past could be dealt with and kind of dispensed with so that everyone could move forward, right? That's the kind of one of the goals of the occupation. So, in the kind of category of trying to dispense with the past, there were, right after the war, a series of purges. So anyone who held, high-level military positions, who held important positions during the war, political military positions, economic positions, those people were purged after the war. There is a war crimes trial right after the war where those thought to be responsible for the war, except for the emperor, were tried. And the kind of narrative of the war crimes trial is that there are kind of basically a handful of people who were responsible for the war, so that once you try those people, everyone else is kind of absolved of responsibility, right? So everyone else can move on now that those people have been tried in this war crimes trial. So that's a kind of, attempt to deal with the past, was to move on. And then, of course, if you're kind of in the category of things that are more forward-looking, there was censorship of all kinds of wartime-related material. So textbooks, like wartime textbooks were rewritten. Anything that had, for example, said laudatory things about the emperor, that was all blacked out of the textbooks and rewritten. A new constitution is written, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, but the new constitution included the demoting of the emperor, who had previously been defined as a divine figure. He becomes merely human with the constitution. The guaranteing of civil liberties, democratization as well. So all of that is in the forward-looking vein. So all of this is going on, but as I said before, the American occupiers are not really present in early summer. And I think there are ways in which actually their absence is weighty. We could ask, what does it mean that there really aren't any Americans. There's an absence of Americans and the occupation in the film. Now, part of that answer could be, as I was just saying before, about censorship, but I also wonder whether Ozu was juxtaposing this kind of exuberant American optimism about the future and the possibilities of the future with a Japanese story, and in Ozu's case, a Japanese story with one of kind of restrained and deep sentimentality about the emotional complexities of the war and the difficulties of moving forward, right? What is much more complicated story than the kind of American version of kind of optimistic future. And I think, for Ozu, he didn't need to explicitly spell out this juxtaposition for his audience in 1951, who was still living the American occupation. So when it came to the war then, it was not fully in the past, and memories of the war lingered into the present. All right, so that's, about kind of this moment of transition as it relates to the war, the meaning of the war, and the American occupation. But there's also a story of transition, I think, in the film, and more broadly, historically, when it came to the economy. So we know in hindsight, and only in hindsight, that the early 1950s were an important transitional moment when it came to the economy. One area in which the American occupation of Japan clearly did not succeed was in the realm of economic reforms. So from 1945 to 1949, inflation surged out of control. The economy remained stagnant. So the occupation brings in 1949, this Detroit banker named Joseph Dodge. So he's sent by the U.S. to Tokyo. Dodge detested government support of the economy or regulation of the economy. The occupation authorities took his advice and imposed harsh medicine in 3 doses: balanced budget, suspension of all state loans to industry, and the abolition of state subsidies. There was an encouragement of Japanese exports. The exchange rate was set at 360 yen to the dollar. And this Dodge Line, what's called the Dodge Line program, did halt inflation, but industry found itself starved for capital. So in the spring of 1950, Japan appeared on the brink not of recovery, but of deepening depression. And this, I think, helps explain the rather desperate economic picture that we saw in last night's film, Stray Dog, which was released in 1949, right, a couple of years before early summer. Now, for ordinary people's daily lives, this was a kind of story of hardship. Right? Collection and distribution of even basic foodstuffs remained chaotic for many years, and many people turned to black markets, which was daunting in its own way because the prices in black markets were so high. Food, clothing, blankets, matches, small luxuries like tobacco were in very, very short supply right after the war. Most serious of all was a shortage of rice. So people found themselves trading kimono as well as watches, jewelry, any other treasured possessions for food. And this was especially true for people in the cities, right? If you were in rural areas, you might be able to grow something for yourself and support yourself, at least at some bare subsistence levels. But for people in cities especially, this was quite difficult. And this situation gave rise to one of the most famous phrases of the time, the takenoko seikatsu, or the bamboo shoot existence. And so the edible bamboo shoot, it can be peeled off in layers, and the takenoko seikatsu phenomenon referred to city people stripping off their clothing in layers as well as other possessions for food in order to survive. Similarly, people of the time spoke of an onion existence, probably with this implication of kind of the crying or the weeping as one peeled off layer upon layer of one's own belongings. Now, what eventually helped turn the Japanese economy around was the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950, in June of 1950. So what was tragedy across the straits was, for Japan anyway, good fortune. So between 1951 and 1953, the Korean War-related procurements amounted to about $2 billion, or roughly 60% of Japan's exports. And exports nearly tripled, production rose about 70%, corporations began to show profits for the first time since Japan's surrender, and responded with this huge surge of investments in new plants and new equipment. So by 1951, food consumption had started to regain post-war, pre-war levels, I should say, and inexpensive clothing became widely available. And even basic household amenities like refrigerators, sewing machines became more accessible, as were certain luxury items like radios and cameras. Now, well, it's true that the Korean War helped jumpstart what we now call Japan's economic miracle, right? This kind of period of amazing double-digit economic growth in Japan. It was not at all clear, even in the early 1950s, that affluence was in Japan's future. This is not an affluent Japan that we're talking about. We're talking about a Japan that's starting to recover from the war. So things were getting better for ordinary Japanese, but this was not at all, as I was saying, the period of double-digit economic growth or a time when the government was pushing the doubling of personal incomes. That would all come much later. So being middle class was not yet the kind of mass experience that it would become. So to give you just one example, in 1953, which is 2 years after the film was released, television broadcasting would begin in Japan. In that year, the per capita annual income was $97, if we convert it to dollars. Television sets cost $470. What all of this meant for many Japanese was that economic uncertainty and insecurity lingered, but there was some room for optimism. And in the film, in early summer, there's some discussion about making ends meet. But if we look at the material culture in the film and what was being consumed, we are clearly no longer in the most desperate years following the war. There are platters of sandwiches for all the neighborhood kids to enjoy. Noriko can splurge on an expensive cake. There are dinners outside of the home, tea with friends in the fancy Tokyo neighborhood of Ginza, an outing to see kabuki. So what we know was an economic transition is also mapped onto the consumption habits of the three generations of the family. So the grandparents do go out to see kabuki theater, but otherwise they don't participate much in any culture of consumption. And you should note that they go to see kabuki, they don't go to a movie or to a jazz club or something like that. They're consuming something very particular. And when they do go out, when the grandparents do go out, they literally sit outside in a park eating a lunch that they have presumably packed and made for themselves. It's the second generation, it's Noriko and her sister-in-law, who splurge on cake and evenings out. And you might want to kind of pay attention to where this consumption takes place, because there's a kind of urban-suburban or urban-rural divide here, I think, because most of the consumption takes place in Tokyo or in the kind of urban environment, mostly in cafes and restaurants in Tokyo. And when the expensive cake is bought, and it's bought outside of the house and brought into the house, which is not in Tokyo, it's outside of Tokyo, it seems somehow out of place. And there's a discussion that doesn't happen I don't think in any other scene of consumption in the film about the price of the cake and how it can't be afforded. So that's the second generation. The third generation, the grandchildren, they are so unfamiliar with wartime hardship that one of them gets upset that what he thought was a gift of a train track for his train set turns out to be a bag of bread when he opens it up. And he's very disappointed by this. And he tosses the bread aside and kicks it around. That toys were something to be bought and not made, and more importantly, that food would be such a given that it could be treated with so little respect was perhaps a unique marker of this youngest generation that would come of age after the war, that was not familiar with and would remember wartime hardship. In this theme, continuing theme of transition and transformation, there's also the question of what we see happening with the cultural and social institutions and practices in the film. Now, since the film revolves around Noriko's potential marriage, let's start with the institution of marriage and what's happening with that at this time. Now, in a way, the marriage that is suggested for Noriko is arranged. And I say in a way because it's not arranged in a formal, conventional way. A real arranged marriage would have meant the existence of a formal designated go-between who communicated between the potential wife and her family and the potential husband and his family. It would have entailed a formal meeting, a kind of conventional marriage meeting between the two marriage prospects and their parents, and a meeting in which the prospective bride and groom, and especially the young woman, well, it was one where there would have been kind of careful vetting of resumes and backgrounds as an important part of this process, and it would have been a process in which the young woman in particular would have relatively little say in the final decision. And there are other films around this time where you get an image of what this formal meeting looks like. You know, you have one family on one side sitting down in very formal wear, another family on another side, and it's a very formalized, kind of ritualized exchange. And that's not what we see in early summer. And I had mentioned before that the careful vetting of resumes and backgrounds was an important part of the arranged marriage process, so much so that even in the mid-1940s, when there were kind of group arranged meetings because of the wartime disruption of families and communities, and also a shortage of individuals who had customarily served as intermediaries or marriage brokers, there were reports that even with these group arranged meetings, the resumes were still checked quite aggressively. But again, that's not what happens in early summer. In this film, Noriko's boss wants to set her up with one of his former classmates and shows her some pictures. And that's kind of like, here, look at the pictures of this guy. You know, it's not very formal. It's quite casual. The boss does not have a conversation with anyone in Noriko's family. The potential husband in question does not meet Noriko or her family. Indeed, we as the viewer never meet this mysterious man. So we do not witness, then, a formal arranged meeting or marriage. But Noriko also does not choose what would have been considered and what's mentioned in the film in passing as the alternative to a formal arranged marriage, which would have been a love marriage. In later decades, after the early 1950s, a love marriage would probably be complete with dating and perhaps premarital sex. But the expression deito, or date, and the practice of dating didn't become popular in Japan until probably the late 1950s, early 1960s or so. So Noriko clearly does not go down the path that you will see if you stay for the later showing of Crazed Fruit, which was released 5 years after Early Summer. The kind of infidelities, lust, and rebellion flaunted in Crazed Fruit are nowhere to be found here. And the absence of physical intimacy in the film is in part a reflection of its time, and by its time I mean the time in which the film was created. It was not until 1946 that kissing was seen on screen in Japan. Film history was made in May of 1946 when Shochiku's film Springtime at 20 opened, which featured a close-up scene of hero kissing heroine. Unknown to viewers at the time, the passion of the moment had been sanitized by a piece of gauze soaked in disinfectant that the actor and actress had placed between their lips. Even so, Kinawa Junpo, which is a leading film journal, deemed the kiss contextually unnecessary. And American occupation authorities, though they tended to view kissing on the silver screen as a wonderful sign of openness and democracy, judged that scenes with promiscuous kissing, I'm not sure what the difference is between kissing and promiscuous kissing, but in any case, scenes of promiscuous kissing combined with jitterbugging and other nightlife activities were criticism of the U.S. because of the suggestion that public displays of affection were due to American influence. Point is, this is not a time where you see a lot of physical intimacy on screen. Now, I don't want to give away the ending to Early Summer, but Noriko ultimately makes her own choice. Her family's desires are not imposed upon her, and the marriage decision is her own. The question to consider as you watch the film then is, why does she make the choice that she does? And what does it mean that Ozu has her make the decision that she does? To answer those questions, it might also be helpful to think a bit about the position of women in immediate post-war Japan. Now, the American occupation of Japan brought new political, economic, and civil rights for Japanese women. So, for example, pre-war ethics textbooks that had emphasized, filial piety and the decades-old idea and ideal of women as good wives and wise mothers was the phrase, disappeared from classrooms. This idea of women as good wives and wise mothers really existed since the late 1800s. It had been forwarded by the government at the time. So this kind of phrase, Ryosai Kembo, was held up and constructed as an ideal for women. So this gets taken out of textbooks in this period. Women were given the right to vote and were granted equality in marriage, divorce, and property rights by the new constitution. Should mention that, Japan's constitution includes an equal rights clause not included in the U.S. Constitution. And this is mainly because of the efforts of one particular woman, Beatty Sarota Gordon, who was part of the American team that wrote the Japanese Constitution. And so I'll read you two articles out of this Constitution that might be pertinent. The first is Article 14 that says, all of the people are equal under the law and there shall be no discrimination in political, economic, or social relations because of race, creed, sex, social status, or family origin. And also Article 24, marriage shall be based only on the mutual consent of both sexes, and it shall be maintained through mutual cooperation with the equal rights of husband and wife as a basis. With regard to choice of spouse, property rights, inheritance, choice of domicile, divorce, and other matters pertaining to marriage and the family, law shall be enacted from the standpoint of individual dignity and the essential equality of the sexes. Okay, so that's the language of the Constitution. And this is the Constitution, I should say, that Japan still uses to the present day. So Japan's present Constitution is an American written Constitution. After the new Constitution was announced, in the late 1940s, there was this massive educational campaign launched so that ordinary people would know what was in the Constitution. And on the day the new Constitution came into effect, the government issued millions and millions of this pocket-sized booklet that was called Atarashi Kenpo Akarui Seikatsu, or New Constitution Bright Life, as part of this effort. And the booklet explained that men and women were now to be considered equal. And this point was illustrated in this booklet by a romantic sketch of a young couple kneeling and holding hands with overlapping Valentine hearts and an exclamation point above their clasped hands. A startled old couple lurked in the background. We are, however, still talking about the early 1950s, so it would seem anachronistic to attribute any feminist motives, and we can talk about what feminist means, and thinking to Noriko. So we might want to ask ourselves, why isn't Noriko married yet? Does she want to get married? And when she's explicitly asked in the film if she is one of those women who don't want to get married, that is she one of those women who has made an intentional decision not to get married, Noriko dodges the question by literally running away from it. She is, at 28 years old, when the film opens, slightly older than the average marrying age in the early 1950s, which was in one's early 20s. In 1950, about 18% of women in their late 20s were unmarried. I should say there's a kind of phrase from around this time called the Christmas cake. So women who were over the age of 25 were considered Christmas cakes. Like Christmas cake, you're good until you're 25 on the 25th. 26, no one wants you anymore, right? So that was the kind of phrase at the time. But in 1950, so while the phrase, good wife, wise mother was falling into disuse after 1945, the assumption that wifehood and motherhood came first for women was still very much perpetuated, especially by conservative politicians and others at the time. Although I think over the course of the post-war era, perhaps motherhood more than wifehood becomes the dominant image of Japanese womanhood. The point is that Noriko's world was not that of the 1970s and after, when women's movements asserted a woman's right to choose to contribute to home life, public life, or both domains, and emphasized choices for women beyond the home. So this is a time when women's movements asserted that women would be able to occupy positions of power in the polity and economy, and that they be free not to marry and to not have children if they should so choose. That, as a kind of guiding tenet of the women's movements, doesn't really happen until a couple of decades after this film. Now, Noriko does work outside the home, But this should probably not be interpreted as feminist rebellion. In fact, it reflects a majority experience of the time. In the late 1940s, it was estimated that as many as 54% of the women in the Tokyo area were working to support or supplement family incomes. And in the mid-1950s, the average age of women in the workforce was somewhere around 24 years old. And another significant characteristic of female labor during this period was the fact that the majority of women workers were unmarried. So about 65% of workers in the mid-1950s, women workers, were unmarried, and left the workforce permanently, either with marriage or the birth of the first child. So ultimately, Noriko's decision, whatever you see as its motives and however you characterize it, has implications for her family. So let me talk a little bit about family. So shifts in the family structure were a longer-term post-war phenomenon. So the average family size was about 5 in the early 1950s. By the mid-1980s, the number is closer to 3. In the mid-1950s, the percentage of families that were multi-generational, like the 3-generation family we see in this film, the percentage of families that were like that were about a third, 32% or so. By 1980, that percentage had decreased to about 21% or so. So you have, over a longer period of time, a decrease in family size, decrease in the number of percentage of multi-generational families. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there was this really neat shift from 3-generation families to nuclear families. Because while the percentage of these multi-generational families fell, the percentage of nuclear families actually remained pretty steady for many decades of the post-war period at about 60-some%. What actually rose was the percentage of single-member households. So well into the post-war period then, the 3-generation family was still at least explicitly promoted as an idea by various programs. So take, for example, as one small example, there were programs that supported 2-generation mortgages, right? So low-interest housing loans offered to people who built 3 generations home, complete with multiple bathrooms and kitchens to provide living space for elderly parents. But despite the valorization of the conjugal couple and the nuclear household, it's likely that the family experience for much of the population has, to this day, included phases where there, phases of life where there's kind of extended household living with multiple generations, and maybe some phases of kind of nuclear household. Now, whether Ozu would consider this the dissolution of the family that he seems to have feared is an open question. So up until this point, I've been trying to serve as a kind of historical guide for the time in which the film was made and set. But perhaps we should not watch Ozu's film as an unchallenged expression of his times, or as the interpretation of the immediate post-war years. Ozu himself questioned the idea that film could capture reality, and some fellow filmmakers at the time actually found Ozu to be out of sync with his own times. So I'd like to kind of juxtapose Ozu with the thoughts of another director named Yoshida Kiju, who was a renowned director of Japanese cinema who would play an important role in what was called the Japanese New Wave, or Shochiku New Wave of film in the 1960s, so a little bit after this film comes out. To put it simply, this new wave was a trend in Japanese cinema that explored issues that had previously not been dealt with very much in Japanese film. So uninhibited sexuality, racism, the position of ethnic minorities in Japan, social outcasts as protagonists. So anything that was kind of the critique, even the destruction of social structures and assumptions, that was the kind of theme of a lot of these films in the 1960s. Yoshida made a couple of dozen films in his career in this vein, including one called Eros plus Massacre of 1969, which was about the anarchist Osugi Sakai and his relationship with 3 lovers. So just in content there, very different from Ozu's films. Yoshida is also known for his award-winning book about Ozu. And this book that Yoshida wrote stemmed from a television documentary series from the early 1990s that was cleverly called Yoshida Kiju Talks About Ozu's Films. And Yoshida reflected on how Ozu, who had, by the post-war period was established and successful in the commercially oriented Japanese studio system of the 1950s, was actually at the time a major target of younger filmmakers' criticism for being too old and conservative to appropriately portray the socio-political dynamics and transformations of post-war Japanese society. So indeed, one famed director, Imamura Shohei, who served as one of Ozu's assistants on Early Summer, once remarked, quote, "I wouldn't just say I wasn't influenced by Ozu. I would say I didn't want to be influenced by him. He stood for everything in Japan against which I wanted to rebel." So according to Yoshida, it was popular young filmmakers at Shochiku to regard Ozu's films as anachronistic and to contemptuously call them Ozu-san-like, or like Mr. Ozu's, in the style of Mr. Ozu. Now, indeed, Ozu's first post-war film, which is called The Record of a Tenement Gentleman of 1947, was almost completely ignored by the post-war audience and was criticized at the time as being anachronistic. The film depicted the lives of poor people in the devastated Shitamachi, or the Tokyo's kind of working-class district. But Ozu did not portray the harshness of immediate post-war reality. Instead, he set the film in a kind of utopia. And by utopia, I mean a place that did not actually exist. So the story is about an old woman and a war orphan, but it's set in a landscape of Tokyo that looks to be in very good order. There are no destroyed buildings, poor shacks, burnt trees, utility poles, anything. So in Yoshida's words, quote, "Ozu-san was not an appropriate kind of person for a period of transformation and crisis. People tend to expect grand narratives in such periods of upheaval. They are likely to welcome motion pictures filled with excessive messages in order to escape from their real-life anxieties. During the wartime and post-war periods, Japanese people were under such conditions. Yet Ozu-san preferred silence to talking, and this was against the spirit of the times." So this is Yoshida's argument that people of the times wanted these kind of overarching grand narratives and these films that were kind of escapist in nature. Ozu's films are not like that. They're very much about the kind of reality of everyday life. And so Ozu chooses instead to focus on the frictions of everyday life, of kind of mundane daily lives, of family drama without dramatic incidents, or without too many dramatic incidents. Of Early Summer, Ozu said, quote, "I was not interested in action for its own sake. I didn't push the action at all, and the ending, in consequence, should leave the audience with a poignant aftertaste." And this disjuncture between what were the kind of large dramas of the times and the small dramas of Ozu's film could also be seen in another Ozu film called Late Autumn, which is a film about the marriage of a character named Ayako. And this is a film that was released, that Ozu released in 1960. What struck viewers about this film is its characteristic Ozu kind of calm and constraint, even though it was released at a time when other directors were acknowledging and recognizing what was an incredibly tumultuous year. I mean, 1960 was a year when thousands and thousands of people took to the streets to protest the renewal of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. It's kind of treaty that this kind of arrangement of U.S.-Japan security relations. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people take to the streets in this year to protest that treaty and the nature of Japan's relations with the U.S. 1960 was also a year where a famous socialist leader was assassinated. 1960 was also the year of a famous labor strike, the Miyake coal mine strike, that was still to this day the longest, most prolonged labor strike of post-war Japanese history. So very tumultuous times, 1960. That none of this appeared in Ozu's films pointed, at least to some, to Ozu's conservatism. Now, Ozu's eye for the subtle, small, some might say trivial changes, as opposed to the dramatic and to the grand narratives, could also be seen in his 1961 film called The End of Summer, about a family trying to marry off their widowed daughter-in-law, Akiko, and youngest daughter, Noriko. Okay, so Ozu made several films with main characters named Noriko. And it starts actually, I think it starts with late spring, so yeah, the thing with the seasons too. Late spring in 1949, in which a character named Noriko dealt with issues of marriage and family. And also in many of these Ozu films, the main female character is played by the same actress, Hara Setsuko. And as an aside, Ozu is known for this quote where he says he's this artist who keeps painting the same rose over and over. This was because of the kind of theme of family and more literally characters named Noriko played by the same person. To give you the full quote, and this ran in a post-war newspaper, Ozu said, quote, "I have always said that I only make tofu because I am a tofu maker. One person cannot make so many different kinds of films. It is possible to eat many different types of food from around the world at a restaurant, in a Japanese department store, but as a result of this overly abundant selection, the quality of the food and its taste suffers. Filmmaking is the same way. Even if my films appear to all be the same, I am always trying to express something new, and I have a new interest in each film. I am like a painter who keeps painting the same rose over and over again." Now, to return to the film The End of Summer from 1961, the one with another character named Noriko, Yoshida, the director Yoshida, had an exchange with Ozu about this film, which Yoshida describes in his book about Ozu. And this conversation takes place in 1963, in January of 1963, at a New Year's gathering, a New Year's party that was held at a restaurant in Kamakura. And I'll read you Yoshida's description of this evening. So this is Yoshida talking here. "Among the 15 or so film directors who were at the party, Ozu-san was the oldest member and was sitting at the highest seat in the room. I was the youngest and was sitting in the lowest seat, right next to the exit. When the party started, Ozu-san came and sat down with me, pouring sake into my cup without speaking. From then on, until the party ended, Ozu-san and I drank sake together without exchanging many words. Because of that, the New Year's party, which should have been a happy occasion, was more like a funeral for me. However, I know very well why Ozu-san did such a strange thing. The previous autumn, I had written a critique of Ozu-san's latest film, The End of Summer, for a magazine, asserting that it did not feel like an Ozu film. The End of Summer had scenes meant to cater to younger audiences. Because I myself was young, I was sensitive to his intent and pointed this out. Instead of arguing with me, Ozu-san silently offered me sake. This was his very Ozu-like response. Ozu-san was that kind of person. At one point in the evening, as Ozu-san was getting a little drunk, he casually said to me, 'After all, film directors are like prostitutes under a bridge, hiding their faces and calling customers.' This was a typical Ozu-san expression, filled with playfulness and humor. Most likely, Ozu-san was metaphorically saying that film has everything to do with commercialism. Simultaneously, he must have been asking me whether it is possible to make films outside of commercial influence." Now, perhaps in this 1961 film, The End of Summer, Ozu had painted the same rose slightly differently, as maybe a compromise to the kind of demands or expectations of the early 1960s. But, these compromises, if there were any, were small. And Ozu was fairly consistent in believing the limits of cinema at capturing the real, which is kind of funny since I think of Ozu's films very much capturing the kind of at least the reality of day-to-day life. But he understood the limits of film, or he believed in them, and he believed that the world was so chaotic that it would be impossible to represent it in cinema. And that therefore where he turned was the drama in the small things, in the poetics of everyday life. Ozu also, I should say, encouraged viewers to use their own imagination without limit, so that his films could continue to evoke new meanings, which I think we should respect this afternoon. All of this is to say that I have been grounding Ozu and Early Summer in time, in history, but we might also consider the ways in which Ozu's films transcended the particularities of the post-war period and transcended time to say something about the inevitable passage of time and irretrievable loss. Thank you. Are there any questions? Anything you're curious about, or?
I just wondered if Tominari has shown up. How? Did you want to take part in the next discussion of the film? Okay. Why don't you just you'll come on up. Okay. This is Tomonari Nishikawa, who's going to be doing the presentation on personal video later in the day, and he's our sort of film technique guy for the discussion.
Thank you so much. Oh, my response to it? Let's see.
You don't have to say something.
Yeah. You have to go on here, but also that'll. Yeah. But first, I think we could do this just first by taking any questions from the audience, and then we can go into any other things we have to say, Mary.
What degree is Noriko a post-war woman? I mean, she's in her late 20s, and she has a job because, in part, of the war circumstances. And would that have been common in other places, as opposed to just specific to Japan?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, usually the story of the post-war globally is one in which women who were part of the workforce get pushed out of the workforce as men return. But what we see in Noriko's case is that she has a particular kind of job. So the kind of job that Noriko has was one that would probably still be reserved for women. So while you see a pushing out of women, for example, in manufacturing jobs, factory jobs, that kind of thing, there's still certain kinds of jobs that are reserved for women. And by women, I really mean young women. And I think you're right that there are a lot of ways in which Noriko is very much a post-war woman. She really comes of age during the war, and what shapes her in these kind of crucial years in the 1920s, the consumption, her job, how she deals with the marriage, are very much a kind of post-war set of expectations and conditions, I think.
I think one of the things that is, I couldn't say how common this would be or not after the war, but one of the things that's certainly funny in the film to pay some attention to is that not only does Noriko not have a traditionally arranged marriage, but she plays a large part in arranging her own marriage. It's done as a kind of negotiation between herself and the mother of the groom. And I hope you'll appreciate the humor in this scene when it shows up, because Noriko arranges her marriage with the mother of the groom. The groom knows nothing about it whatsoever, and his response when his mother tells him about it is low-key, as everything is in Ozu, but it's very funny. Warren?
Just a couple of comments. It seemed interesting to me that it basically sounds like the U.S. kind of wrote a equal rights amendment.
That's right.
To the Japanese Constitution.
Yes.
Women couldn't get one fast here.
Yes.
I mean, the other is that I was curious about this kind of forbidding, portraying the occupation in film. I was thinking it's like Sam Fuller's House of Bamboo, I think is the name of the film, that is made about, I mean, it's a crime film like Memories of the Bars, it's a great film. But it's set in the Japanese occupation in Japan, but they wouldn't let Japanese filmmakers show the occupation. It seems rather strange. Just a couple comments.
Yeah.
There are, although Ozu doesn't show the occupation in direct ways, it sneaks in tiny ways. As I said when I was down at the other side, there's one American serviceman who sneaks past in the background of a street scene. And I don't know whether that was, Ozu was famous for setting up his sets and his scenes, fanatically. He would famously reshoot a scene many, many times and just go into the kitchen and move a jar that was on a shelf to a different position and then reshoot the whole scene. So it seems as if everything in his films is carefully shaped, carefully formed. But in one street scene, you'll see it's towards the end of the film, if you pay real close attention, there's an American serviceman who walks past at the end of the street. And I think it's just an accident. I think he was just, he didn't shoot much in plein air, he didn't shoot much outside, but, and I think that it was an accident, but, you know, it could be that he was just sneaking it in there on purpose. And there are some English signs and some other things that are tucked in there.
You have to look carefully for them.
Right, but they're there.
Yeah. And I mean, it's obviously, you know, perhaps obviously with U.S. occupation censorship, that was especially true when it came to anything related to the atomic bombing, so any kind of atomic bombing literature, anything about that. So there's very little spread of information about what had happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki beyond those two cities.
Some other questions? I wanted to do a little more with one thing that Eiko was talking about before I roll Tamanari in here.
Sure.
She was talking about the fact that Ozu didn't do and was criticized for not doing the large-scale, you know, epics of what was of these huge transformations taking place in Japan, or the destruction. You know, in the Kurosawa film Last Time, you see several scenes where you see, actually it's a studio set, but you see a bombed-out scene where he's lying next to the pool where the Yakuza is throwing stones at him and so forth. There's hardly any destruction in Ozu. In one of the scenes in this film, you'll see that the two boys run away from home. The father punishes them because they've kicked the bread, and so they run away. And you'll see them walking along the seashore. This is in Kamakura, which is on the coast. And there's railings which have been destroyed, but it doesn't necessarily look like war destruction at all. It's a kind of just wear and tear that would be common along the seacoast. There's no particular point made about this being a post-war situation. But at the same time, he has, and this is what I talked about in my talk at the other side, he builds into every single scene these little, small, low-key signs of change. Every single scene is a mixture that has traditional Japanese elements and modern Western elements in it, and then there will be sudden cuts in the editing of the film, where you move, you know, very suddenly from a totally Western scene, for example, a cafe that has a Picasso copy of a Picasso picture painted on a very large one, painted on the back wall. And then you'll have an immediate cut to the interior of a traditional Japanese house where right at the moment in that cut you don't see any kind of Western element whatsoever. And my very favorite one is one where you're at the great Buddha of Kamakura, a famous, very large Buddha statue in a park now in Kamakura, the temple that housed it got washed away in a tsunami. So the statue now stands outside in the park. And you'll see the daughter of the woman who lives next door, who is Noriko's soon-to-be mother-in-law, and the little girl that will be her stepdaughter. And the little girl is there at the foot of this great Buddha in this very, very pretty, frilly little Western frock. And amongst all the many scenes in the film, that one always just strikes me because you have this cute little girl in her cute little frock right at the foot of this gigantic bronze Buddha statue. And in itself, it's an image of this radical process of change that's going on in Japan. So I just wanted to put that in as a footnote of what Eiko was saying about the fact that there's no large-scale plot elements that deal with these changes, but they're there in this very, very typical for Ozu, low-key, underground, understated kind of way. Okay, now I wanted to end this section by around 1:45 to give everybody a sushi break. The movie's supposed to start up at 2:15, so I want to bring Tomonori in now. See what your responses were.
Sure. Of this talk, or it's more about my response to
just
Sure.
The idea is to just point out some things you find interesting that people
Sure.
can look out for in the film.
Sure. I am a filmmaker, so when I watch a movie, I cannot think of what's outside of the frames. So the movie is mostly about what's on the screen, but I cannot stop thinking of what's happening behind the cameras or around the frames. So thinking of Ozu's style, people are saying that it's very unique and it's very interesting to me. The one is the camera position. The people are thinking that's very low, but it works very well because at that time, usually in Japan, the houses, they did not use chairs at the dining tables. The dining tables are very low, and they are using, it's called zabuton, very thin cushions, and they are sitting on the floors. So that's low camera position works very well. And it may appear very slow, but also takes because a long take. He loves long takes, and camera usually do not move. They are only, well, I haven't counted, but
Just a couple.
yeah, the some shots you would see the camera movement was on a dolly, and one was actually on a crane too.
One
But-
great shot.
Yes, that's beautiful. But the most shot camera is stationary and just showing the scenes. So the cards, I don't know if he ever used, but you don't see any fade in, fade out, or dissolve these techniques. Transition is almost always clear cards and juxtaposed to the next shot. And since camera is almost always stationary and the scenes, you can see only one angles. You can't see any other angles, but he changed the angles of the scenes a lot. But that's very unique because it's a little bit confusing. Like we are so familiar with techniques by like Hollywood or like mainstream cinema. When we see the image through the cameras, we try to understand what kind of perspectives we are looking through. And sometimes camera shows one character's perspectives, the viewpoint. But others, it work in that way, but at the same time, it's so unusual because almost like these characters are talking to you directly. That's one thing. But also sometimes he changed the cameras in the position or area in the scene that's previously there's no cameras. I'm not sure if I explained well, but for example, there are three peoples at the scenes, and the camera shows three peoples. Two peoples are facing towards cameras, and one person is facing behind. But then the camera switched the position and now showing one person's face pointing towards cameras, but two persons are pointing against the cameras. So that's kind of switch, almost like a 180 degrees switch. That works very strange way. And since the location for this the movie taking place inside of the house, and the cameras, of course, shows some part of the house, but the camera does not move. But these people are moving inside of the house, and the camera does not follow, but just showing when they are going out of the frame or coming into the frames. So there's a connection between one person's movement, but it's very difficult to understand actual like floor map of the house because of such strange techniques. Well, I can go on, but
Right, it's an odd effect. There's the space of the film seems very stable because the camera doesn't move and you see the same corridors and whatever. And yet, for the total picture of the space these people inhabit, it's actually very confusing or difficult to imagine. You can't picture the whole place at all because the camera doesn't follow through the corridors or whatever the doors. Noriko will disappear out of the frame to go upstairs, and it's like she just flew away like a bird. You don't follow her up the stairs. You never see the stairs. You never see the steps. These people get from the first floor to the second floor like magic. But you never see how they do it.
right.
Yeah, and so although everything seems very stable, there's also sort of an element of disorientation to it.
I think that's disorientation. That's why I'm interested in actually also this film. Not only about camera works, but also acting. It's very strange. Some may think that's very bad acting. But it seems to me he does not care much about like acting. But it's important to show the actors showing that smiling face or crying. It's more like a lines. So he may have asked the actors to smile, but maybe it doesn't matter what kind of smiles. But many directors cares about this. But to me, it's more like, okay, here's a smiling in the contents, so the people, the viewer, would understand what's happening, the cause of the smile or cause of the cry. So the acting, it's so strange to me, but I'm not sure to Western eyes, but also lighting It's very strange to me. If you are carefully following, well, you don't need to follow, but following the shadows of these characters, you would notice where the light sources are. It's a very strange way he led, and almost because he wants to make a perfect visual composition, and lighting is a key, especially in black and white images. So he decided to move around the lights to make a perfect composition for his ideas. And sometimes it's too perfect and does not look like real. But that's away from reality. I think that's what he was interested in. So acting does not seems like real. They are just doing acting or reading lines. And this lighting and also camera works, totally strange. But that's kind of strangeness, you would get used to it. You can still follow what the kind of narrative he wants to deliver. But still like holding, that's kind of like a weird strangeness. And that's why I think I love his works.
The actor that plays Noriko's brother, the actor's name is Chishiryu, doing that in the American order. He was in almost all of Ozu's films. I forget the total number, but Ozu made 53, 54 films, and Chishiryu was in all but just a few. And Ryu said that late in life, he said that he had absolutely no talent as an actor, and he didn't think of himself as an actor. All he did was he just sat there and he did what Ozu told him to do. The acting is not what we would think of acting at all. It's not like expression of your emotions or something. It's not method acting. It's not where you get inside of the torment of this moment and then express it through the torture on your face or something. Ozu would tell his actors is exactly what to do, to start saying your line as you pick up your pencil, continue it as you raise your pencil towards your face, then finish the last two words as you turn it away to the right. And then he would have them repeat that until it seemed expressionless. Okay, the first few takes would seem to him as if it was too expressive of emotion or of their own personality or something, and he would have them redo it and redo it and redo it until it became kind of numbed. Okay, and that's what he wanted. He wanted this kind of just basic level. And again, I think that Tomonai's comments are quite appropriate here. As you look at it, it'll seem like perfectly ordinary life. It'll seem perfectly realistic, and yet there is a strangeness to it as well. It's in some ways it's too perfect. It's too perfectly manipulated. The scenes are too formally, perfectly designed. Right. Okay, and it creates a strangeness as well.
Like for example, like arrangement of peoples at the scenes, like for composition's sake, some scenes may look so strange. For example, if he has a camera here, but if he were shooting us, three peoples on the tables, we can see three faces. Well, usually we see it like this way. But for the visual composition, he would, I guess, ask us to see it like this way. So different position. So then the viewer can see all of our faces. But that's strange. And you see, like families are sitting on the tables. Well, this position where they are sitting, it looks so strange. But for the visual composition, that's perfect because viewer can see their heads at least. You know what I mean? Like they are not like hiding like behind, like so it's. But to me, it's so strange. But he's doing this because of the sake of visual composition.
Yeah, it's also strange because it's a very childlike or innocent thing to do. If you ask a child to draw a picture of people sitting at a table, and one of those persons would be obscured because someone was sitting in between, the child will draw all those people so you can see them all and see their faces. He won't pay any attention to the fact that he's changing the scene or not doing it in realistic perspective because one of these people ordinarily would be hidden behind another. He'll just show you them all and he'll turn them so that their faces show to you, okay, turn their necks around so you can see everybody's face. Well, that's a little too extreme, but... Okay, I think, unfortunately, we'll have to break at this point.